What if everything you believe is stable, your identity, your thoughts, even reality itself, is actually in constant motion, changing every second without you noticing it? Gilles Deleuze didn't see the world as something fixed or predictable. He saw it as something alive, something that's always becoming something new. And once you start seeing the world this way, nothing ever feels the same again. Gilles Deleuze was born in 1925 in Paris, a city that was already one of the intellectual centers of Europe. His early life unfolded in a world that would soon be shaken by one of the most devastating conflicts in modern history. When the Second World War reached France, daily life changed rapidly. German occupation brought uncertainty, restrictions, and a constant sense that the structures of society could collapse at any moment. For a young mind growing up in such conditions, the experience left a quiet but lasting impression. The world was not as stable or predictable as it might appear. Unlike some philosophers who begin their journeys with a clear sense of purpose, his path into philosophy developed gradually. As a student, he showed strong intellectual ability, but what distinguished him was not simply intelligence. It was a certain independence in the way he approached ideas. He did not seem satisfied with repeating established interpretations. Instead, he was drawn to thinkers who challenged traditional assumptions and opened new ways of understanding reality. After the war, he pursued his studies in philosophy in Paris, where the intellectual atmosphere was alive with debate. Existentialism dominated much of the conversation at the time, with thinkers focusing on freedom, responsibility, and the meaning of human existence. But while these ideas were influential, he did not fully align himself with them. Rather than focusing primarily on human experience as the center of philosophy, he became interested in something broader and more abstract. He began reading deeply across the history of philosophy, engaging with figures such as Spinoza, Nietzsche, Hume, and Kant. What drew him to these thinkers was not simply their conclusions, but the way they approached problems. Each of them, in different ways, attempted to rethink the foundations of philosophy rather than accept inherited frameworks. This approach resonated with him and would shape the direction of his own work. Instead of treating philosophy as a search for universal truths that remain constant over time, he began to see it as a creative activity. Philosophy, in his view, was not about discovering fixed answers, but about creating concepts that allow new ways of thinking. This idea would become central to everything he later wrote. One of his early contributions involved reinterpreting the work of earlier philosophers in ways that revealed new possibilities within their ideas. Rather than simply explaining what these thinkers had said, he approached their work as something alive, something that could be developed further. For example, when he wrote about Spinoza, he did not treat him as a historical figure whose ideas belonged to the past. Instead, he presented Spinoza's philosophy as a powerful system that could still challenge modern ways of thinking. Similarly, his engagement with Nietzsche focused on the idea of difference and becoming rather than fixed identity. Nietzsche had argued that reality is not composed of stable, unchanging entities, but is constantly in flux. This emphasis on change and transformation became a key influence on his own philosophy. During these early years, he began developing his own approach to thinking about difference. Traditional philosophy had often treated difference as something secondary. The primary focus was usually on identity, on defining what things are, and how they remain the same over time. Difference was seen as deviation from this stable identity. He challenged this assumption by suggesting that difference itself might be more fundamental than identity. Instead of beginning with fixed categories and then noting variations, he proposed that reality is fundamentally dynamic, composed of processes, changes, and interactions. Identity, in this view, is something that emerges from these processes rather than something that exists independently. This shift in perspective had far-reaching implications. It meant that the world could not be fully understood by breaking it down into stable categories. Instead, it required attention to movement, transformation, and the ways in which things continuously become something new. as his work developed. He became increasingly interested in how these ideas could be expressed in new philosophical concepts. Rather than relying on traditional language that emphasized stability and structure, he began experimenting with ways of describing reality that captured its fluid and dynamic nature. This approach eventually led him to collaborate with another influential thinker, Félix Guattari. Their partnership would produce some of the most challenging and innovative works of late 20th century philosophy. Together, they explored ideas about society, desire, and the organization of thought itself, pushing philosophy into entirely new directions. Their collaboration was unusual because it combined philosophical thinking with insights from psychology, politics, and cultural analysis. Instead of separating these fields, they treated them as interconnected, reflecting the complexity of the world they were trying to understand. Through this work, he continued developing the idea that reality is not organized around fixed hierarchies or stable structures. Instead, it consists of networks of relationships that are constantly changing. Understanding these networks required a new kind of thinking, one that moves beyond traditional categories and embraces complexity. By this stage of his life, he had established himself as one of the most original voices in contemporary philosophy. His work did not offer simple answers or easy conclusions. Instead, it challenged readers to rethink the basic assumptions that shape how they understand the world, opening the possibility for entirely new ways of thinking about reality itself. As his philosophical voice became more distinct, he moved further away from the traditional image of philosophy as a discipline focused on defining stable truths. Instead, he began building a way of thinking that treated reality as something constantly in motion, something that could not be fully captured through fixed categories. This shift became even more visible through his collaboration with Félix Guattari, a psychoanalyst whose background brought an entirely different perspective into their shared work. Their partnership was not a simple exchange of ideas, but a deep intellectual fusion. Guattari had worked in experimental psychiatric clinics where traditional models of a human mind were being questioned. Rather than viewing individuals as isolated subjects with fixed identities, these environments explored how people are shaped by social, political, and psychological forces that interact in complex ways. When these ideas met his philosophical approach, something entirely new began to take shape. Together, they challenged one of the most dominant frameworks in 20th century thought, the idea that human behavior can be explained through stable structures such as identity, family roles, or fixed psychological patterns. Traditional psychoanalysis, for example, often focused on interpreting human desire through rigid frameworks. But they argued that desire is not something confined within individuals or defined by simple categories. Instead, it flows, connects, and produces new realities. This led them to introduce one of their most striking ideas. Desire is not a lack, not something people feel because something is missing. Instead, desire is productive. It creates connections, relationships, and systems. It is a force that actively shapes the world rather than simply reacting to it. This completely reversed the traditional way of thinking about human motivation. To describe this dynamic reality, they developed the concept of the rhizome. Unlike a tree, which grows from a single root and branches out in a hierarchical structure, a rhizome spreads horizontally, forming networks without a central point. This image became a powerful way to understand how ideas, societies, and even identities function. There is no single origin or fixed center. Instead, everything is connected through shifting networks that can expand in multiple directions. This concept had wide implications. It challenged hierarchical thinking, where systems are organized around clear levels of authority or origin. In a rhizomatic structure, there is no top or bottom, no single starting point. Knowledge, culture, and identity all emerge from interactions within networks rather than from a central source. As they continued developing these ideas, they also examined how societies organize and control these flows of desire. Modern systems often attempt to structure and regulate behavior through institutions such as governments, corporations, and social norms. These systems create patterns that guide how people think and act, sometimes limiting the free movement of ideas and creativity. They describe this tension as a struggle between forces that organize and stabilize reality and forces that push toward change and transformation. On one side, there are systems that try to define identities, establish rules, and maintain order. On the other side, there are movements of becoming, where new possibilities emerge and existing structures are challenged. This way of thinking extended beyond philosophy into politics and culture. It offered a new way to understand how power operates, not just through direct control, but through the shaping of desires, habits, and expectations. Societies do not simply impose rules from above. They influence how people want, think, and connect with others. During this period, their writing style itself reflected the ideas they were developing. Instead of presenting clear linear arguments, their texts often moved in multiple directions, connecting different concepts in unexpected ways. Reading their work could feel less like following a traditional argument and more like navigating a network of ideas that continuously open into new paths. This approach made their work both influential and controversial. Some readers found it liberating because it broke free from rigid ways of thinking. Others found it difficult or even confusing, arguing that it lacked clarity. But regardless of these reactions, it was clear that their work was pushing philosophy into new territory. At the same time, he continued working independently, developing his own philosophical concepts alongside the collaborative projects. He remained deeply interested in the idea of difference and how it shapes reality. Instead of seeing difference as something secondary to identity, he argued that difference is what generates everything. Identity is not the starting point, but the result of ongoing processes of change. This idea challenged one of the most basic assumptions in Western philosophy. For centuries, thinkers had tried to define what things are, focusing on stable identities. But if reality is fundamentally about becoming rather than being, then understanding requires a completely different approach. It requires attention to movement, variation, and the emergence of new forms. As his work continued evolving, he became increasingly recognized as a philosopher who did not simply interpret the world, but attempted to transform how thinking itself operates. His ideas encouraged readers to move beyond fixed categories, to see connections where they had not been seen before, and to embrace the complexity of a world that is always in the process of becoming something new. As his philosophy continued evolving, he pushed his ideas into even more radical territory, moving further away from any form of thinking that relied on stability, fixed identity, or final structure. What made his work especially powerful during this period was not just the concepts themselves, but the way they began connecting into a larger vision of reality as something alive, unpredictable, and constantly creating itself. He was no longer simply challenging traditional philosophy. He was building an entirely different way of seeing the world. At the center of this development was a deeper exploration of what it means for something to exist in a state of continuous transformation. The idea of becoming, which had already shaped much of his earlier thinking, now expanded into a broader understanding of life itself. Becoming was not just about change over time. It was about the way new forms of existence emerge from interactions, from encounters, from moments where something unexpected takes place. Reality was not a fixed structure waiting to be understood. It was a process that unfolds through events. These events became a key focus of his philosophy. An event, in his view, was not simply something that happens at a specific moment. It was something that creates a shift in how reality is experienced. It opens new possibilities, new directions, new ways of thinking. Events break the continuity of what seems stable and introduce something that was not there before. In this sense, life itself can be understood as a series of events that continually reshape what exists. This way of thinking required a completely different approach to time. Instead of seeing time as a straight line moving from past to present to future, He explored the idea that time operates on multiple levels. The past is not simply gone, and the future is not entirely separate from the present. Different layers of time interact, overlap, and influence each other. What has happened before continues to shape what is happening now, while new possibilities constantly emerge within the present. He also began exploring how thought itself operates within this dynamic reality. Traditional philosophy often assumed that thinking involves recognizing stable truths or representing the world accurately. But he argued that thought is not simply a mirror of reality. It is an active force that participates in the creation of new possibilities. Thinking is not about repeating what already exists, but about encountering something new, something that disrupts patterns and forces the mind to move in a different direction. This idea led him to challenge the assumption that thinking is always rational or orderly. Genuine thought, in his view, often begins with a kind of shock or disruption. Something unexpected forces the mind out of its habits and opens it to new possibilities. This moment of disruption is not comfortable, but it is necessary for creativity. Without it, thinking remains trapped within familiar patterns. His work during this period also placed strong emphasis on the idea of immanence. Instead of looking for explanations that exist outside the world, such as transcendent truths or higher realities, he argued that everything must be understood within the world itself. There is no external framework that fully explains reality. Everything that exists is part of the same continuous process. This concept of immanence reinforced his rejection of hierarchical thinking. Traditional systems often place certain ideas or structures above others, creating levels of importance or authority. But in his philosophy, there is no ultimate center or foundation that governs everything else. Reality is a network of relations where everything exists on the same plane, interacting and influencing each other. As these ideas developed, his collaboration with Félix Guattari continued producing works that expanded this vision even further. Together, they explored how social systems, political structures, and cultural practices interact with these processes of becoming. They examined how societies attempt to organize and control flows of energy, desire, and creativity, often imposing structures that limit the open possibilities of life. At the same time, they emphasize that these structures are never absolute. No system can completely control the forces it tries to organize. There are always points of escape, moments where new possibilities emerge. These moments represent opportunities for transformation, where existing patterns can be broken and new forms can take shape. His influence during this period spread widely across different disciplines. Artists, filmmakers, and writers found inspiration in his ideas about creativity and transformation. His philosophy encouraged them to experiment with new forms, to break away from traditional structures, and to explore new ways of expressing experience. Despite the growing recognition of his work, he remained a thinker who resisted simplification. His ideas could not easily be reduced to clear formulas or straightforward explanations. This complexity was not a weakness, but a reflection of the reality he was trying to describe. A world that is constantly changing cannot be fully captured by rigid concepts. By this stage of his intellectual journey, he had developed a philosophy that was not just about understanding reality, but about engaging with it in a new way. It invited people to see the world not as a fixed system, but as a field of possibilities, where change, creativity, and transformation are always present. This vision of reality as a continuous process of becoming, shaped by events, interactions, and creative forces, marked one of the most original contributions to modern philosophy. It challenged deeply rooted assumptions about identity, time, and thought itself, opening the door to new ways of thinking that continue influencing philosophy and culture today. As his life moved toward its final years, the intensity of his philosophical vision did not fade. If anything, it became even more focused, more distilled, as though he was trying to bring together everything he had been working toward into a clearer expression of how life, thought, and reality itself should be understood. By this stage, he was no longer just a philosopher writing about abstract ideas. He had become a thinker whose entire project was centered on one powerful conviction: that life is not something fixed or given, but something that is constantly being created. This belief shaped the way he approached not only philosophy, but existence itself. He rejected the idea that human beings should be understood as stable identities moving through a predictable world. Instead, he saw life as a field of forces, a space where different energies, desires, and processes interact to produce new forms of existence. Nothing stands still. Everything is always becoming something else, whether slowly or suddenly, whether visibly or beneath the surface. During this period, his reflections on life became more personal and more intense. He began thinking deeply about what it means to live within a world that is defined by constant change. If everything is always in motion, then stability is not something that can be taken for granted. It becomes something temporary, something that exists only for a moment before transforming again. This perspective can feel unsettling, but for him, it was also a source of freedom. Freedom, in his view, was not about escaping constraints entirely. It was about recognizing that within every system, within every structure, there are always possibilities for change. Even the most rigid forms of organization cannot completely stop the movement of becoming. There are always cracks, always openings where something new can emerge. These moments of transformation are not exceptions. They are the very essence of life. He also returned repeatedly to the idea that philosophy should not simply explain the world, but should expand the ways in which people can experience it. Concepts are not just tools for understanding. They are tools for living. They shape how people see, feel, and interact with reality. A new concept can open a new way of experiencing the world, just as a piece of music or a work of art can reveal something that was previously invisible. This is why his work remains so closely connected to art, literature, and cinema. He believed that artists often reach places that philosophy alone cannot. Through images, sounds, and narratives, art can express the movement of life in ways that go beyond traditional language. Cinema, in particular, fascinated him because it captures time and movement directly. Films do not simply represent reality. They create new ways of seeing time, perception, and change. In his writings on cinema, he explored how images can reveal different layers of reality, showing how time unfolds not as a simple sequence, but as something complex and multidimensional. Just as his philosophy challenged linear thinking, his analysis of film showed how visual storytelling can break away from simple narratives and open new forms of experience. At the same time, his personal life was becoming increasingly difficult due to declining health. Years of physical struggle began to limit his ability to work and move freely. Yet even in the face of these challenges, his commitment to thought did not weaken. If anything, his reflections became more focused on the question of what it means to continue creating, to continue thinking, even under conditions of limitation. For him, thinking was not something separate from life. It was a way of engaging with life, of participating in its ongoing creation. To think was to resist stagnation, to refuse to accept the world as something fixed and unchangeable. Even in moments of difficulty, the possibility of new thought remained a form of movement, a form of becoming. In 1995, Gilles Deleuze died at the age of 70. His death marked the end of a life dedicated to pushing the boundaries of thought, but it did not mark the end of his influence. His ideas continued spreading across philosophy, art, political theory, and cultural studies, inspiring new generations to rethink the nature of reality, identity, and change. What makes his work stand out is not just the originality of his concepts, but the way they invite a completely different relationship with the world. Instead of seeking certainty, his philosophy encourages exploration. Instead of defining fixed identities, it opens the possibility of transformation. Instead of viewing reality as stable and predictable, it reveals a world that is alive with movement and potential. His legacy lies in this shift of perspective. He showed that the world is not something to be fully captured by rigid systems of thought. It is something to be engaged with, something that is always unfolding in new and unexpected ways. By focusing on becoming rather than being, on difference rather than identity, he opened a path for thinking that remains as dynamic as the reality it seeks to understand. In the end, his philosophy leaves behind a powerful insight. Life is not a fixed story with a clear beginning and end. It is an ongoing process of creation where new possibilities are always emerging. To understand this is not to find a final answer, but to recognize that thinking itself is part of that process, part of the endless movement through which reality continues to become something new.